Joining us at the 10th anniversary of Ryerson Social Justice Week. As people stream in and find us on cyberspace and settle in, you can take in some information about all the different ways that you can get in touch with us. You'll see that up on the slide right now. We want to hear from you, so send us your feedback. Let us know what you're thinking. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're using the hashtag Social Justice Week 2020. And we want you to also get some information about some books from the folks that you'll be hearing from. So Take Back the Fight, if we could show the next slide. Organizing Feminism for the Digital Age by Nora Loreto. That's just come out. And Border and Rule, Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism by Harsha Walia, which is forthcoming in 2021. So we'll put those slides up again at the end of the session. Today we go beyond provincial borders to bring you Gendering the Political Landscape with Beverly Bain in Ontario, Harsha Walia in BC, Nora Loreto in Quebec, and Vicky Mochama joining us from the Maritimes. So we're straddling 3 different time zones. My name is Kike Roach, and I am the Unifor Chair in Social Justice and Democracy at Ryerson University. As hosts of the event, I'm situated in Takaronto, Toronto, on the lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, and the Huron-Wendat peoples in the Dish with One Spoon territory. And we're thankful to be able to live and work here. We're coming to you through Zoom, and as Indigenous Studies Professor Jill Carter has said, Zoom has erected its headquarters in San Jose, California, on the traditional territory of the Muwekma Ohlone Nation. And I quote her, "We are indebted to the Muwekma Ohlone people as the lands and waters they continue to steward now support the people and technologies that carry our breaths, images, and words across vast distances to others." As we turn our minds today to a discussion that reflects on feminist struggles, I also want to say that we're remembering the sacrifices, the courage, the resistance of our ancestors dispossessed of lands, enslaved, expelled, forced to flee violence. We remember the creativity and determination of those who made it possible for us to be here today, and we're grateful for all of their labor. To bring you this event, it takes many minds and hands. So I want to say a big thank you to Dr. Winnie Ng, who founded Social Justice Week 10 years ago. We want to say thanks to the Faculty of Arts, Dean Pamela Sugerman, the Faculty of Community Services, Dean Lisa Barnoff, and all of our sponsors. And we also want to thank our ASL team from Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service, Marcia, who you see on screen now, and Christopher, and our captioning team at CCS, Corinne. We also want to thank Brian from Media Services and our communications team, especially Julia, Noshin, and Emily. But I want to say a very special thank you to Salman Khan, who's the assistant to the Unifor Chair, whose excellent work we've relied on for years. He's been with Social Justice Week since its inception in 2011, and he's just a great person to work with. We are really happy that Vicky Mochama is here to moderate this conversation. Vicky Mochama is a writer whose work has been published in the Globe and Mail, the Washington Post, the Walrus, and Toronto Star. Her journalism focuses on issues of race, gender, immigration, and politics, and she has been the host of Canada Land Commons, Safe Space, and No Little Plans. And she co-founded the podcast company Vocal Fry Studios. She was an editor of the national best-selling humor book, The Canada Land Guide to Canada, and she has admitted that she has terrible taste in movies. Vicky, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Kike, and I'm so glad everyone could be here. I really want to take a minute to thank everybody who has been participating and attending and joining the Social Justice Week events. I know I had Zoom fatigue before all of this even started, so I just want to thank everyone for putting away their exhaustion, anxiety, and any work you were doing just to pause that and join us for this conversation. And I am just so humbled and delighted to have our panelists here. And I'm really, really excited that so many of you have joined us today. Just so you know, we're going to find a way either on the hashtag or otherwise to take in some audience questions. But, I want to encourage you all to use the Social Justice Week hashtag to participate in the chat. I'll keep an eye on it. And if I see any conversations or questions that we can bring into our chat, I will do that. And I wanted to ask Kike if you could do the introductions for our panelists.
Oh, okay. I had just assumed that you would do it, but I don't have that right here with me. Perhaps what we can let people know.
Oh, I don't have them in front of me.
Okay. What we can let people know is that there's full bios available for everyone on screen on our website at ryerson.ca/social justice. So you can find out about all of our panelists on our website.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And truthfully, a lot of them don't even need an introduction because they are stalwarts and icons of the Canadian feminist movement and of organizing and social justice in Canada. And I want to bring them on. Dr. Beverly Bain is a Black queer feminist activist who has been organizing in Toronto, and she teaches in women and gender studies at the University of Toronto. Dr. Bain, I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Thanks for having me.
Our next panelist is Nora Loreto, who is based in Quebec City, as Kike mentioned. She is the author of Take Back the Fight, Organizing Feminism in the Digital Age, and From Demonized to Organized, Building the New Union and Union Movement, an excellent book about the labor movement in Canada. Hi, Nora.
Hey, Vicki, good to see you.
Nice to see you.
Hi, Beverly.
And finally, we have Harsha Walia. Harsha is an organizer in migrant justice, anti-capitalist, feminist, abolition, and anti-imperialist movements for the last 2 decades on unceded Coast Salish territories. And she's been involved in a number of grassroots movements, including No One is Illegal and the February 14th Women's March. And she is currently the executive director of the BC Liberties Association. And I'm so excited, Harsha, to have you here today. So I want to kick off our conversation about feminism with a chance to give our audience maybe some background on how Canadian feminist organizing came to be and what it has looked like. And Dr. Bain, I'm going to ask you to start us off because this year marks the 50th anniversary of the report for the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. And I know it's a lot to ask, but can you describe how that came to be and the trajectory of the feminist movement that has organized since then?
And Beverly is fine. You can, so we can.
I can't. My ancestors will kill me if I call you by your first name.
Fine. Beverly's fine for the conversation. Okay. Well, let me start. I just give you sort of a. I'll actually do a little brief in terms of how I want to shape this conversation, and just to say, and I think people should know that we are starting off with just 5 minutes of trying to pull a context together, because of course it will be really brief, but that we'll be picking it up, we'll be picking up the conversation as we go on throughout the conversation. So what I'm giving you here is just really a brief caption of the movement. So let me start by saying that there is a general consensus that from its earlier years in the mid to late 60s, that the Canadian women's movement had 2 distinct streams of development. On the one hand, there were women from the established women's movements such as the Voice of Women, the Canadian Federation of University Women, and the Fédération des Femmes du Québec. And on the other, there was the community-based or grassroots movement. But I want to shift that narrative of understanding Canadian women's feminist movement in Canada, like others such as Linda Carter-Dion Brand, Mary Jo Nadeau, and Judy Rebick in her 10,000 Roses, where she actually did a whole historical review of the women's movement and the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, which actually initiated which actually was the forerunner of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, and the Royal Commission on the Status of Women was a commission that women in the who worked in publishing, in the women's movement, in government, actually, and who were part of these organizations I mentioned, actually called for. The government wanted to manage that and to handle that. The recommendations, 161, came out of that and was placed on, on hiatus, like all other recommendations for everything that gets, especially when it means change and holding the government accountable, got placed on hold. And of course, they were all, relative to equality rights issues for women. And that led to, NAC coming into existence, the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, to actually sort of be the groundwork of the women's movement and to take up those recommendations. But I'm wanting to shift the narrative of understanding the Canadian women's feminist movement, because it is important to understand that in various ways during the periods of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Black and racialized feminists were engaged in spaces with white feminists while organizing in their own spaces. I want to actually argue to rethink the kind of power issues that shaped the movement, which were really very homogenized power that seemed to that shaped everything along dichotomous lines, which it did because of the way society is organized, but also to say that it wasn't that it wasn't that rigid and clear and linear, that there were a lot of interruptions and a lot of interventions being made by different factions of the women's movement. The Royal Commission on the Status of Women, which later formed itself into NAC, continued to work on securing equality rights and for women, was made up of feminists from the already established groups that I mentioned, and included women from Labour and Aboriginal women. Yet the issues that NAC came to be identified with were that of a liberal feminist discourse on equality rights. Nadeau carefully traces what she calls NAC articulated its identity through various discursive emergences, she says, specifically hegemonic political, racial, and national discourses of liberal feminism, unmarked whiteness and discourse of unity and diversity. So in spite of the fact that there were challenges from other white feminists, from the labor movement and other movements, and from racialized movements, that NAC still, through its frame in relation to state and lobbying and being funded by the state, and actually operating in context of, depending on which government at the time was in power and how one engages in lobbying with that government. And the fact that whiteness and gender were the organizing factors, we see that within NAC itself, that there was this organizing around particular racial and national discourses of liberal feminism, of whiteness, of unity and diversity. Central to Nadeau's argument is that these discourses, practices of whiteness and nation, was the way the organization continued to maintain itself as white and mainstream. So NAC's lobbying focus meant it relied on a large number of member groups to legitimize itself as the leader or as constituting the women's movement and feminism in Canada. But as Rebick in her book, 10,000 Roses demonstrated, NAC was a site of contestations on issues from its beginning, but more so in the 90s with the shift from a leadership that was primarily white to one that reflected women of color.
Wonderful. I think that's a broad history. And I wanted to ask you very quickly if you could tell us about, that second stream of, that women of color who were challenging and contesting what NAC was doing.
And that second stream, let me was actually, I mean, in the 90s in particular, was when you saw NAC shifted. Because at that point, NAC actually started, there were more racialized women who actually started becoming involved in NAC. NAC, you know, had a series of member groups. And these women who were member groups were also, some included NOIVM, the National Organization of Immigrant and Women, some in the Congress of Black Women, another racial anti-violence movement, and other organizations that included racialized women, Intercede, which included Filipino women, and other organizations that included. Some of these women became board members, right, of NAC. And that started shifting the ground of NAC during that period. But simultaneously, while that was happening, there were other contestation happening, particularly IWD, the International Women's Day Committee. Right? There were other contestations happening within the movement. And what I'm trying to do here is to shift this sort of, you know, this linear and dichotomous and this sort of idea of waves, right? Because the movement actually, there were more happening interactively. There were more pushes coming from all different positions, all different points. Right? Black women were organizing in coalitions with other racialized women. They were organizing separately, and they were all organizing around, you know, more than equality rights. They were organizing around labor issues, but organizing in the context of issues of migration, issues of shifting the ground in terms of the actual politics to one that actually reframed the political landscape to look at politics in the context of transnationalism, to look at it in the context of left-wing politics. And IWD also was formed by Marxist feminists and labor activists, but they also consolidated around whiteness. And I just want to end with something that I think is really critical, because the Black Women's Collective did something very profound in shifting the ground of IWD and also shifting the ground of the feminist movement. And I'll end here. Dionne Brand, and this came from a discussion she had with Judy Rebick. Dionne Brand said, we came into the room, and this is what she was talking about IWD, and said, wait a second, what do you mean? And how do you do this? And what kind of decisions are you making? There was capable women who had run IWD for a long time, and the bureaucracy of it was well in hand. So we came in conflict with some of the ways they did things. Suddenly it was very charged. We also had connections with some Aboriginal women in the Native Women's group. We got in touch with all of them. We invited them to the meetings. And then we got in and we saw that they were deciding about how IWD should go. And we said, hold it. Right? We stopped the meeting. We said that decisions got made without necessarily being democratic, that racism in the society means something about how power is distributed. You can't have the tyranny of the majority. That shook things up in the coalition that year. And it's in 2000 that we saw the dismantling of the feminist movement, and it was attributed, I would argue, to the rise of neoliberal conservative agenda, the multiple power relations that were operating in spaces of feminist mobilization and activism that sought to undo a lot of binaries that foster the production of rigid binaries.
I think that's a fantastic spot to bring Nora in, because Nora, that's where your book, picks up, which is, not only is, Beverly's talking about the dismantling of the feminist movement, but you pick up at the, opening and I guess expansion of the digital age, which is where the internet comes in. Talk to us about how the digital age has impacted feminist organizing in Canada.
Yeah, it is a perfect segue into this, because to look at how NAC collapsed, and I go through this in the book, it's exactly that. It was the confluence of white supremacy within the women's movement and white feminists' inability, refusal, or errors. I mean, in Judy's book, there's women that express regret that had they known or whatever, they would have acted different. White women, they would have acted differently at that time. But that, at the same time as the rise of neoliberalism, just destroyed the way that feminists in the mainstream movement had been operating for years. And so what I was very interested in, as someone who came to age under Mike Harris, being on my parents being on strike and learning about labor relations in a very direct way under Mike Harris.
And that was in Ontario in the 90s, yeah.
In Ontario in the 90s, in the summer of 1997, which was in November when we were all on strike, and everyone got to hang out on strike, which was formative and amazing and whatever. The rise of neoliberalism meant that all movements had to fundamentally change. And I think that the late 1990s, in the popular kind of memory of activism, we think of globalization and how the globalization movement really hit its peak, moving right towards September 9/11. September 11th, 2001, when all of a sudden, organizing changed with incredible repressive against racism, Islamophobia, and then of course the war in Afghanistan. And so feminism during this moment, it doesn't go away, of course. There's still feminists that are organizing, but it tends to go back into those collectives, into community-based groups, or and Judy Rebick made this point to me in a way that I didn't really know, I didn't appreciate. She said we're seeing movements led by women, especially racialized women, that were not women's issues. So we're seeing women's leadership, Harsha, of course, being a really major part of that, within migrant justice organizing, known as Illegal, and OCAP, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, and a lot of other movements that would kind of underpin what the left looked like in the 1990s and into the 2000s. The digital era, though, has really changed how everything organizes. And what has been so fascinating about feminism is we're in this era now where if you ask an average person, are you a feminist or not a feminist, they aren't likely to tell you that that's a bad word, and they're not, and they, of course, they're feminists. And I think the most obvious example of this was, of course, Justin Trudeau trying to become the feminist prime minister as his first order of business, not like after having done literally anything. He had just announced his cabinet, and he said he was a feminist because his cabinet had a gender balanced cabinet, which of course was something that François Legault, who's Quebec's premier, who is not progressive or a feminist, he also had a gender balanced cabinet for his first cabinet in 2018. So it wasn't a big deal. But why then was there not much challenge to that narrative that Justin Trudeau is a feminist? Journalists ran away with it, and he mostly got away. At the same time, we're seeing the rise of things online like Me Too, Been Raped, Never Reported, which was, of course, the precursor to like a Canadian version of Me Too. And this incredible activism under the banner of feminism, run mostly by racialized young feminists, doing incredible work, but not necessarily getting into influencing government policy. And part of it, and this is what I argue in the book, is because the government has done such a good job at assuming what feminism is, because in the neoliberal era, it becomes about self-identity. And it doesn't actually become about the work that you do, and it doesn't become about the social policies that you might enact. It just becomes about identity, and then it becomes about how much money you're giving away to what organization. And so we've seen increased funding to women's organizations like the YWCA, and other community-based organizations, but we still have a government that is absolutely not feminist. And so looking at the title of this talk, gendering politics, it's so interesting that we can have a government that calls itself feminist at the same time as a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We have a crisis of resource extraction that, of course, has feminist implications. And then we have a prime minister says, well, we're going to run the Trans Mountain Pipeline through a gender-based analysis. We're going to run the Site C Dam project through a gender-based analysis. And if you recall, when they said that, Jason Kenney was like, well, these jobs provide good money for men, and the government never had an ability to push back and say, well, actually, there is a gender-based analysis to be had on these projects, and guess what? The results are going to be not in your favor of feminism, right? The results are going to be that these projects actually cause misogyny, racism, colonialism, which of course these things are all connected. So the digital era has in some ways has allowed people to discover feminism, has allowed people to take the mantle of feminism on like never before. but it hasn't necessarily given people the ways to organize, to bring their personal beliefs into something broader. And so that's what I'm really interested in, and that's what I hope that we can talk about a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I want to jump off what you mentioned about, the various crises that are happening in Canada and how the feminist movement has responded or not responded to them. And we are in, the largest health crisis I think the world has ever faced collectively, and as well as, an economic challenge and a crisis that has hit so many people in a variety of ways. But, we're hearing in many different ways and in a number of ways that the pandemic has hit women extremely hard. I also want to, bring in Harsha for this because, borders themselves have become a public health tool, and many of the economic gains that women have been effectively erased. Can you talk to us about how you see the impact of COVID on women?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be in this conversation. I want to say that I'm on unceded Coast Salish territories before I start. These lands belong to the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. And this is, of course, so pertinent to this conversation as well, right? Because we know that one of the main pillars of settler colonialism was gendered colonial violence, was the specific targeting of Indigenous women, trans and two-spirit people, and Indigenous children. And so, when we're thinking about gendering the political landscape, of course, that's such a pillar in terms of also eradicating settler colonialism. And here I want to invoke the words of Jessica Danforth, who, when asked to comment about feminist waves, said, quote, "Fuck the waves, we are the ocean." And so I just want to, bring that into the space, and it really resonates with everything Dr. Bain or Beverly, and Nora have talked about in terms of, how do we even think about feminism, right? Is it simply about thinking about those who are in the silo of women's issues, or are we thinking about the ways in which women and trans people and queer folks are really at the center of all social movements? And that, can we actually have a feminism, to pick up on what Nora was saying, can we actually have a feminism that is not anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and more? And, I think we would all argue that you can't, right? That doesn't give you feminism in terms of what feminism has always intended to be. And that is something that becomes very stark in the context of COVID, where absolutely we see, the disproportionate impact on women. And that's an intentional disproportionate impact, because we know that the system was based on many violences, including the violence of the gendered violence of social reproduction of life, right? The ways in which that is unwaged or underwaged, in which that is devalued. And so with COVID, we see a number of things happening. We, of course, see the added burden of domestic work on women, whether that's, the added burden of childcare and domestic labor. And that's across the classes, right? I'm not talking about rich and middle class folks who are, suddenly whining about not being able to pay for domestic work. I'm talking about the added burden with schools, with schools closing, et cetera, that falls across classes on all women, particularly on women. And so, we see the added burden of labor, often unpaid and unenumerated and invisible gendered labor that COVID is bringing on women. The added strain of lifting emotional labor in spaces, of dealing with the consequences of social isolation and carrying that lift of emotional work. We're seeing in many cities, an increase in domestic violence and intimate partner violence that are being reported across cities, because of course we have, the ways in which violence manifests, the ways in which the external plays itself out in the interpersonal, and the ways in which those are connected. So we have all of these that are operating in the intimate sphere. And of course, as feminists, we know there is no intimate sphere, right? Everything that is private has deliberately been made private and privatized to remove it from public conversation. And then we also have the very real ways in which particularly oppressed women are impacted. So, women are the ones who are most likely, especially and particularly racialized immigrant women, Black and brown immigrant women, who are classified as essential workers, which we know means that you are essential to capitalism, but you yourself are disposable, right? So in some of the most unsafe working conditions, whether that's the front line of healthcare, or that's retail workers, or that is care workers. And I would want to point out that just yesterday, migrant care workers released a very important report on the experiences of migrant care workers during the COVID pandemic. I'd really suggest people take a look at it. And the ways in which the COVID has really exacerbated the marginalization and exploitation of migrant women workers in particular, in every sector. We also have, it's not a coincidence that some of the largest outbreaks of COVID are happening in prisons. And some of the largest outbreaks have been in women's prisons. And, in opposition to a kind of, liberal feminism that Dr. Bain was talking about, it's been quite encouraging to see the rise of an anti-carceral and abolitionist feminism informed by Black feminism that rejects prisons as a solution to situations of violence, right? That rejects prisons and policing and caging as a solution to any form of violence. And, we see this, and this is particularly important in COVID because prisons are an epicenter of the pandemic, including women's prisons. And we're seeing the perversion. We're now in some prisons, we're even seeing, we're under the guise of, preventative care. More and more women are being put into solitary confinement or health segregation. And so we're seeing even more punitive measures within prisons under the guise of supposedly keeping incarcerated people safe, which is, the weaponization of the pandemic to bring in more repression, to bring in more austerity, bring in more punitive measures. We're also, of course, in the context of COVID, not seeing, though so many things have been stalled. The border has closed. So we're told that refugees whose movement is actually essential, right? There is arguably no more essential movement across borders than that of refugees who are seeking safety, who are fleeing persecution. Refugees have, as Vicky, you've pointed out, are having to contend with a completely shut down border. The country agreement was recently found to be unconstitutional and illegal. But refugees cannot seek safety, though, of course, visitor visas, luxury visas, and the visas of migrant workers, including women migrant workers, continue to be processed because, again, the essential movement of capital needs to continue under COVID, but the safety of people is completely disposable. And we continue to see the repressive arm of the state, with ongoing police murders, particularly of Black and brown and Indigenous women, and especially Black and Indigenous women, with Regis Kruczynski-Paquette, Chantel Moore, and many others who continue to be murdered. And this is where particularly the Black feminist invocation of "say her name" is so vital, which is, a feminist invocation. And of course, Idle No More and Black Lives Matter continues, and our feminist movements in that they are led and they are grounded in a feminist politic that is a deeper feminist analysis than the kind of liberal feminism that Dr. Bain was talking about, right? It's feminism that has always been the ocean, that has always been here. And so there are so many ways in which the COVID pandemic has exacerbated the violences that oppressed women face. And at the same time, we see the rise in both digital and mass movement organizing that is centering a different kind of feminism. And, I want to be clear here that it's different, it's not new, but really revitalizing and growing on a feminism that has always been with us in different ways, that has always contested a liberal feminism, but that is really now taking an increasingly center stage and is really on the shoulders of giants, right? We stand on the shoulder of all the giants before us that have made this possible, but that are articulating a deeply robust feminism that is anti-capitalist, that is anti-imperialist, that is anti-colonial, and that meaningfully centers the experiences of trans women, of sex workers, of migrant workers, of Black and Indigenous women, right? And that really understands that the entire social organization of our world is built on gendered violence that's connected to so many other kinds of violences.
And I think I want to jump on something that you mentioned about how the pandemic has exacerbated so many of these conditions that we knew were abysmal, but has now created, pushed them to a real crisis level. And I'm going to open this up to everybody to jump in because, I wonder, is the pandemic, is that something you would consider a setback for feminism, or is it an opportunity for feminists to begin to organize? And maybe Beverly, I'll start with you.
Okay. I just want to kind of make one. Thank you so much, Howard, and Nora, for your pieces. I just want to say, just kind of clarify very, very quickly, because I think it's really important that what we're seeing now in terms of the movement, which actually is, grounded in a feminist politic, that grounding and that feminist politic existed during that era of the 80s and the 90s, and was a politic that Black radical feminists who were lesbians and who were queer during those periods actually pushed forward into other movements. Particularly, we saw that in IWD. So that particular grounding has always been there. And I think what needs to be really clear and what needs to be really clarified is that what we're seeing now in terms of the kinds of political organizing is not only just grounded in a left politics, but it's grounded also in a Black radical feminist queer politic that actually is shaping the struggle, is shaping the movement, as we see a particular kind of indigenous resurgent and refusal movement is shaping the indigenous movement today. And that was always present, but is resurfacing because of the conditions that we are experiencing, has given rise to this kind of resurgence. Not that they weren't there before, but it has given rise, and new elements have been introduced, but which means that the movement has been expanded. It's less homogenized, but it's really grounded in that Black political radical politic that I think needs to be identified. Also, in terms of answering your question about whether the pandemic is an opening for feminist activism, or it's a hampering. The pandemic, I see it actually as the only opportunity. I see it as the opportunity for us to rethink political organizing, right? I do see that the pandemic does that at this point, because really we have no other alternative as far as I'm concerned. I think we are living in a very one of the most difficult times for most of the people who are living today. They've never lived through a pandemic, neither have they witnessed such fracturing in terms of, or political and social economic contexts, in terms of how that is affecting people. I mean, the thing that the pandemic has done, and I think what it has given us, it has actually allowed us to see, how public health policies and policing and other forms of surveillance and other ways in which economic and socio-political policies are actually particularly shaping the lives of particular people for death. Even more so today. So we see what it's doing for indigenous people. We're seeing, these things have been happening, but what it's doing is that it's actually putting front and center whose lives actually matter and whose lives don't. So, immigrant and racialized migrant women, who are living without status, who are fleeing for their lives, Black women incarcerated, racialized indigenous women, particularly are the women who are the most, as Howard says, are the most, at risk. But what we also say is that there is something to be said about this particular climate, as it actually veers down on particular bodies more than others, such as ours, as Black and brown bodies, which is why the kinds of political activism that needs to take place has to be led by particular people in the movement. It has to be facilitated as it's being facilitated now, through, an uprising that involves and is led by Black queer radical feminists, an uprising that also is led by indigenous women in terms of their resistance movement and resurgence movement. And I think that is where, and that's the direction, and that's the direction that we have to go in terms of the kinds of organizing that needs to happen, that we need to be organizing along the lines that actually focuses on the afterlife of slavery and the genocide of Indigenous people.
Nora, I want to bring you in on that because, you know, when you were speaking, you mentioned that some political organizing, you know, is happening in the digital age. It's, you know, in that kind of awareness space, but it's not necessarily bringing forth policy changes and changes that are substantive to what a number of people need. And so I look across the country, you know, we have maybe a feminist prime minister at the top. We have a lot of grassroots organizing around feminist policy and feminist ideas, but then there are, you know, almost coast to coast men leading the country who I would not describe as anywhere near feminist or even interested in feminism. What do you think how can those, you know, challenges be tackled in this era?
Yeah, it's a funny kind of separation of activism, right? Where the most radical activism that is happening right now is land reclamation struggles and Black Lives Matter, defund the police, abolitionist struggles, and how do those struggles intersect with like forcing your local member of parliament, who's probably bad, to do something, and that guy probably has no power anyway to do it. And so what I think that the pandemic has done is the veneer that has covered a lot of these realities up for so many people who have not seen them or who have refused to see them. The veneer did not anticipate staying a veneer during a pandemic. And so that veneer has collapsed and everything is now laid bare, such that even people in power cannot deny what people have been saying for generations are the problems in this country. And so, like, one of the things that I think about a lot is it's like, how do we get people who are more isolated than they have been because of the pandemic, isolating people, whether you're isolated to your work, whether you're isolated to your home, whether you're a student that's trying to do class online, how do you get those people together, have a space for people to develop radical politics and find the movements that they can get involved in that goes beyond those awareness campaigns? Because I think that the struggles that are the most radical and that are doing the most right now, I personally have not only do I have no place, but I have no like criticisms. Like I have no thing to say, the folks at Land Back Lane aren't doing that correctly. I mean, everything there is like amazing. And I sit back and I'm like, how can I help? How can I support? And then I think of the struggles that I'm involved in Quebec City that are related to Islamophobia and racism in the city. And then like, how do we get people together in the pandemic? And that's where I'm really struggling to think about these ways of organizing. And I think, as Beverly is saying, this moment to actually throw out how we organize, throw out the traditional ways that we interact with politicians, throw out the way that we look at lobbying and how we use certain amounts of money to try and use money to create change. I think now is the time that we can finally say to people who are sympathetic to those kinds of ways of organizing, to say that's not going to work. That's not going to work. That might create some minor reforms, and here's the result of those reforms. The result is that they might help some people, but they will leave most people behind. And so for me, this moment is also really important because it's a radicalizing moment. And I've seen that radicalization across a lot of different kinds of people who weren't at all involved in politics, people who may have been minorly, interested in voting, maybe liberal, maybe NDP, are now looking back and looking at things and saying, oh, you're actually naming the experiences that I have, but the experience that I've seen my family's had. How do we go further than lobbying and these traditional forms of activism? And the problem, of course, that the internet has told a lot of people of a certain generation that change does come through awareness, right? Change comes through maybe a representation here and there, a little bit of awareness, and then that's all it takes, which I think, as we're talking about, that's not true. And so there's also a lot of work to be done to make sure that we're kind of teaching that for those generations that have only lived with the internet, to say, like, here are the tools that the internet provides, and here are the difficulties in terms of allowing us to organize in real life or across regions, across difference, across language, across movements. And I'm very, very, very optimistic about our prospects to do that. I think that this is a moment that I've never, obviously, like none of us have ever seen, but the spirit around organizing right now is just really incredible, while we're also like could we go into the streets? And of course, the answer to that was answered by Black Lives Matter in June, saying, of course we can go in the streets. We need to go in the streets right now. And people going, hey, we can go into the streets even though we're in the middle of a pandemic. So it's a lot to be learned for sure.
Harsha, are you equally optimistic?
Depends on the day. I'm very optimistic listening to Beverly and Nora, to be honest. You'd asked me yesterday, I would have said no, or even an hour ago. I think I am very optimistic for all the reasons that we've talked about, right? Which is that the terrain is completely shifted. And when that terrain shifts, there's so much that we can build and continue to build. And, again, emphasizing and following up, Beverly was saying, nothing's new. This is all ground that we've gained and inherited from struggles before. And even in thinking about, for example, the example that I gave of the migrant workers report that recently came out, we know that, one of the grandmother of all migrant worker organizations was Interseed in the 1980s, which is, a Black feminist migrant worker organization that fought particularly for Caribbean women and Caribbean migrant workers. So all work that we do builds on existing work. And builds on existing movements, and specifically, as Beverly was saying, our current movements and the ways in which we gain and build on Black queer feminist organizing and Indigenous women's organizing on these lands. So that is what makes me optimistic, is that ground was always there and is resurging in ways that are anew. And that is optimistic, because that really is the ethical orientation that we need to build on, right? Those are the voices that need to be centered, and in ways in which, were contest stations earlier, but now hopefully have more space to be in leadership roles. Always were in leadership roles, but now are also in leadership roles in quote unquote mainstream feminist movements, right? Because the mainstream feminist movement has imploded in some ways. And instead we see the ongoing work of social movements take that place, right? Rather than a kind of homogenous dominant idea of what feminism needs to be or look like. So I'm optimistic about that, which is that, the genuine, meaningful heterogeneity and diversity and leadership of Black and Indigenous women, of queer feminist organizing, of sex worker organizing. The piece that I'm less optimistic about is, how do we meaningfully engage with this new social media kind of terrain, right? How does it not become constant hashtags? I mean, in some ways, the radicalization process is so much faster because there's a democratization of how we can access media, right? We're not relying on newspapers or having to publish newspaper. We know all that, right? With our access to information is faster. We can radicalize ourselves faster. Once we get interested, we're able to access so much more information. But then the processes of what we do with that, how do we build collective structures? And by that, I don't mean bureaucracies. I mean, how do we build collective movement spaces to discuss, to debate, to grow, to build our community organizing skills, all of that kind of intangible work that is the work of social movement change. That is harder to grapple with, particularly the ones that take us beyond the cycles of mobilization. And by that, I'm not in any way saying that's not happening. I'm just saying that is a new kind of thing we have to contend with in the context of the pandemic. And how do we build those, that web of social relations that really allows us to continue through those cycles, right? That allows us to continue our work. So that is one thing that I'm thoughtful about, but overall, I'm so optimistic. I mean, for, I don't know, polls, and Vicky, you probably have more thoughts on this, right? This is your wheelhouse, but I'm always encouraged when I see those polls that are, like 40% of Canadians believe that we should defund the police. Like, that's unimaginable in many ways, right? Like, many of us and many before have always fought to defund and abolish the police, but to have more and more folks thinking along those lines one can only have optimism, right? It shows that people are aligning and coming alongside and are being guided by Black queer feminism, are being guided by abolition feminism, are being guided by Indigenous feminisms. And so, but that of course isn't enough, but I do still find some amount of hope. I don't know if hope's the word, but I do find some encouragement in that. But yeah, the question is, where next, right?
I mean, I wish I could share everyone's optimism, but I think I've been talking to a friend of mine about like the concept of the idea that people are being radicalized towards justice. And I was like, but the opposite is actually also happening. You know, you see the anti-mask protests, you see people really, you know, vociferously being in defense of the police who maybe otherwise might not have been, you know, registered an opinion other than like they like the police. And so I think the opposite is also happening. For every step forward, there's a backlash to that step forward. And so that's, you know, that kind of brings me to my next question, which is, how do we contend with, you know, an opposition that is also just becoming as organized on social media? How does feminism grapple with, you know, these regressive movements that are coming together? You're seeing right-wing nationalist groups coalescing together, especially around the pandemic, especially around, you know, an opposition to government, which I think, you know, has a parallel also in some, you know, in you know, left-wing and activist organizing. But, you know, there is an organized body building together that has always existed, but you're seeing it really, really expand. Nora, I know you've dealt with them personally, and it's a question that you know, talk about in the book. How does feminism really grapple with this evolution?
Yeah, I think that, like as you said, and you know, as we all know, that kind of the violent white supremacy is literally baked into Canada, and so the fact that we're seeing more people be openly violent whitely supremacist is you know, how much of that is it was hidden, or how much of that are people radicalizing towards this moment. Certainly in Quebec, what we see, which is very unique to this province, is because of the multilingualism here between French and English, there's definitely this axis of like France, United States, Canada, so European, American, Canadian white supremacy, racism, fascism, that is very, very, very dangerous. And because of that nexus, it makes Quebec a very important location for international white supremacist organizing, which we've seen, you can see in a whole bunch of different ways. But I think that, like, I think what's happening more is simply that all of the lies of liberalism, like all of the lies that these extremes never existed within society, and that centrism was what everyone kind of accepted as being our dominant status quo, liberalism is collapsing. And that idea that there hasn't been these fringe or these extremes is not necessarily true. We're just seeing them, I think, appear in a different way now. And so for sure, the internet brings people together who wouldn't otherwise necessarily know each other, and they radicalize each other, and it becomes really, really violent and dangerous. But one of the things that I've been very confused by, and I write about this, is where is the quote unquote feminist movement, whether it's a formal feminist movement or people saying, as a feminist, I am doing this, fighting against the far right? Because it seems to me like that's a very natural confrontation that needs to happen. And that's especially white women, because white women play such a disgusting role within white supremacy as well, which is like equal parts innocence, but then also like childbearers and protectors of the white race and all this kind of garbage. And so, like, how do we then fight against this far right sentiment that's both organizing online and organizing in our communities? And oftentimes, you know, like, first of all, it's dangerous work. And so, like, you know, women are less likely to take risks when it feels dangerous for a whole bunch of socialized and legitimate reasons. But because it's dangerous work, it also means that we need to be organized in ways to help protect people who are the ones who are putting themselves out to confront the far right. And I think that that the lack of a feminist analysis in fighting the far right has meant that it's just become this weird, like, left and right macho male kind of space where kind of like everyone gets kind of caught in the crossfire, and we don't really have a strategy at all to deal with the far right beyond Antifa organizing, which is, you know, spotty across country and not necessarily going to be able to kind of like successfully confront the far right. And so that's something I've been thinking a lot about, and how do we build, and how do you take a feminist analysis into this space and meaningfully confront these folks, give each other strength to know that you can stand up to white supremacists and say, like, what, are you going to kill me? And then, you know, hopefully they don't. And find ways to organize to actually protect one another. I was just speaking this week when I launched my book. Sandy Hudson was mentioning that in Los Angeles, there's organizations that actually come to help move people when they're receiving death threats. They actually find them temporary places to live and give them like the tools to be able to withstand these kinds of attacks from the far right. And I think we're very behind in that on Canada. And so I'm very interested to think about also how we can build those kinds of communities to keep each other safe as these threats become increasingly brash, even if they've always existed.
Beverly, I want to get your response to how does the feminist movement respond to this evolution?
Okay, a couple of things. First, I want to address the issue of optimism, because what I was saying is that there is the opportunity to move forward, to change, to reconceptualize what this world could look like, what feminism could look like, how feminism can actually reshape this world. I was also saying that so the optimism I'm thinking about is that which we can actually take up. But as you know, I mean, I think as Harsha says, and the reality of the matter is that there are some areas here politically where we continue. You said it actually very well, that where we continue to see these as we move, and we embrace movements and we embrace some kind of forward moving, we see more repression. But that is the way how power gets constituted, right? That as we move forward, there is always this terrain that pushes back, and that's how power works in political activism. It's always worked that way. Now it's even much more obvious, because I would argue that struggle right now is much more fluid than it was in the days when they were actually organizing around particular structures, right? Where there was some, you had the Black Power movement, and you had the Panthers, and you had a feminist movement that had a structure, blah blah blah, which allows a certain kind of folding in. But with a fluid kind of movement like that, where things seem to be a lot more open, there's less opportunity, or there's more opportunity for all kinds of intervention from powers that are problematic, that we are seeing more violence, more increased surveillance, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of where the feminist movement, I first think we have to stop kind of thinking of feminism as white women in this country. And I think when we talk about the feminist movement, we often think, well, we're not seeing the feminist movement do this, but there are those of us on the ground who have actually been organizing around a gendered, frame around policing, right? I mean, I've been doing it for 40 years, right? In terms of dealing with police, it's always been a gendered frame. And so the work that is being done, Indigenous women have been doing it. I mean, the whole idea of the Idle No More movement has been around. It's women who actually did this, and actually did this through a media platform, the hashtag Idle No More, but also confronted a much more sustained, which also, got fragmented again, the way that power works in this particular time. Which actually, I think, speaks to the fact that, and I think Harsha mentioned it, or I'm not sure who mentioned it, but to the fact that I think it was Nora, that capitalism itself is actually in somehow being undermined. And this was clear at the beginning of the pandemic, that capitalism actually is being undermined, right? So there's an implosion happening. I mean, we're seeing it in the US, but we certainly saw it here around the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, when the government was throwing money at people. When does the government throw money at you, right? When does capitalism actually allow itself to just divorce itself from its ground? And certainly the pandemic did that. But what happens in those places is that there's a constant, a grappling back and forth. So yes, so we're at this particular juncture where it becomes, how do we as feminists actually move forward? And I think that, again, and I want to say, and I want to emphasize that feminism as it is not about, white women actually kind of mobilizing the movement. It's about white women actually seeing that Black and Indigenous and racialized feminists are actually mobilizing the movement, and what their role is in terms of supporting and undermining, the nation state as it exists.
I think that's a great point to sort of begin our, I guess, wrapping up so we can open up some audience questions. And I just want to ask you, it's I guess, a big question, and one we've been talking about across this is really, where do we go from here? And I kind of want to give you like an exercise, mostly because I'm staring straight at this light and I want to give myself a break. But, if you close your eyes and you're thinking about this future that we're all looking ahead at, and there's a vaccine, there's finally that Rihanna album we've all been waiting for. And, what steps have been taken by feminists in Canada to ensure that we have a feminist future? And I'm gonna start with you, Harsha. What are you looking to see? What are you hoping to see?
Such a great question. I want to just say it's just such a delight and an honor to hear Vicky, Beverly, and Nora, all of you, and to think alongside. It's just so. Delight's a weird word, but it's how I feel. Maybe I will, in terms of what I imagine, if I can just say a few quick things to preface that, which is that in terms of the question of optimism, because it's sticking with me, I have to say that part of my answers around feminism is partly informed by an ambivalence around the feminist movement, but deeply committed to feminism, and I think that is part of what this terrain is, right? Is like this contestation that Beverly has spoken about so eloquently, which is, there's this understanding of the feminist movement, TM, and yet feminism is happening every day. Feminism is happening every day in social movements. And so part of it is like, how do we not necessarily move from feminism, but reimagine feminism as being constituted in a multiplicity of spaces, right? That there is not one feminist movement. There is feminism in all social movements, and in fact is grounded and leading, and has always and continues to be led in so many movements, right? So part of that is grappling with that it just looks completely different. Sorry, I shouldn't say it looks completely different, but it's being constituted differently in terms of not being these large structures. And so that, I think, is really central in terms of how do we imagine moving forward, because it might not actually look like rebuilding the feminist movement in the ways in which people might think, are we going to rebuild a massive, rebuild a NAC, for example? That might not be what rebuilding the feminist movement looks like, right? It means reorienting and re-understanding that there are feminisms that have always been grounding this work, and how do we build up and support those movements? So I think that's perhaps obvious, but I do want to say that, because sometimes when we think about rebuilding, people talk about building the feminist movement or rebuilding the feminist movement, it's kind of like a white nostalgia for a particular kind of feminist movement. So I think we do have to reject that. We have to embrace the multiplicity and the leadership of a different kind of feminism that may or may not even explicitly identify themselves as feminist, right? Because we know it's grounded in feminism, but may take the form of abolition, of course, may take the form of movements to dismantle settler colonialism, right? That those are pillars of those movements, but that they are expansive. Movements to dismantle the nation state, to dismantle to dismantle imperialism. All of these kinds of movements are deeply grounded in feminism, but may not explicitly have feminism as their primary banner. And so I think that is part of it. I think the other piece that I think the feminist movements and those of us guided principally by feminism have to get really clear and strong on rejecting reforms that impede revolution. Of course, we all operate in a terrain where there are reforms, particularly here, drawing on the Black Panther Party and many others, right? The idea of reform pending revolution, and the work of Mariam Kaba on, non-reformist reforms, but squarely rejecting reforms that are reformist, that maintain the status quo, that are basically co-opting our social movements, right? So there's a range of those kinds of reformist reforms that we have to squarely reject, particularly because the feminism, TM, and I say TM as, to say not all feminist history, but we know that there are dominant strands of feminism that have been implicated in the service of empire and racism and white supremacy and oppression. Whether that is carceral feminism, that has seen the expansion of the carceral state under the guise of victims' rights, has called for more policing under the guise of white victimhood, right? So we see a whole strain of carceral feminism that has been to the detriment of left feminism. We have seen feminism in the service of imperialism and empire, such as those feminists who shamefully supported the occupation of Afghanistan and Canada's role in the occupation of Afghanistan. The kind of feminism in Quebec that is Islamophobic, that takes the guise of a kind of so-called secular feminism, but that is really just deeply white Christian supremacist, that has spoken against Muslim women's rights to wear the niqab and hijab under the guise of women's right to, under the guise of women's equality. So there are many of these kinds of feminisms, carceral, imperialist, and more, that we have to squarely reject. We have to reject reforms that impede revolution in the service of all women. And I think two other things, this is, what do we do, just to that earlier point about what do we do in this kind of terrain of the rise and the radicalization of the right? I think the feminist movement ethically has to, and particularly in this climate, has to absolutely reject trans misogyny and say squarely that trans women are women. And we know that one of the spears of the far right is trans exclusionary feminism, right? We see this awful convergence between some feminists and the far right, who under the guise of free speech are espousing trans misogyny and transphobia. And I think feminists, particularly cis feminists like myself, have to be better. I just have to get better about really taking on trans misogyny squarely, both because that is an ethical orientation that we are required to do as feminists, that we are called on to do, and because it really is central to part of the rise of the right? The ways in which trans misogyny is being weaponized. And the last thing that I will say, and this is particular, but I think paying attention to the ways in which all carceral regimes and the impacts of austerity are disproportionately impacting women. Like, one of the things that the feminist movement has not actually taken on in any way, and here again, talking about feminist TM, is issues like child apprehension, right? Like, there are more children, as we know, Indigenous children, particularly Indigenous Black refugee children, who are in state care, but really state kidnapping. And this is a squarely feminist issue. And, I say this was in Vancouver. I know this is the case across the country. Of course it is. But when we talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, that means also caring about child apprehension. When we talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the ongoing legacy of genocide, that must include child apprehension. And so I think also taking on, as feminist issues, as feminists have done, the rights of children. And particularly the rights of children for families who are targeted by genocide.
Nora, I want to ask you to add to that briefly, because I want to get to at least one or two audience questions in. What are some steps you'd like to see, immediately? And I apologize, that's a very CBC question to ask you for one solution. But, if you could, one thing.
Well, I think like everything Harsha said is like, just, I'm sure everyone's sitting at home going, oh my, right? It's amazing. And so what I think is like, how do we take everything that Harsha just said and bring that into being mainstream feminism? What is the process by which we do that? Where are the places we have those debates, those discussions, the learning, the education? Because when this world is reconstituted after the pandemic, it's obvious that there are forces that want it to be absolutely worse, that they want it to be more austerity, more state repression, and absolutely worse. And so the struggle that we have to engage in to make sure that it is not worse, but it is in fact better, does require that revolutionary mentality in terms of actually fighting against power. And that means convincing a lot of women that what they know to be feminism is not going to cut it, is not going to lead to liberation, is not going to actually lead to reconstituting the state in a way that is more fair.
And Beverly, I want to give you the last word on this. What are some steps? I'm sure there are, things you've seen in your time that you're still waiting to have done. What are some steps that you think could help us build that feminist future? Oh, I think you're muted.
Appreciate very much my two, the comments from Harsha and the comments from Nora, in terms of, how we should be constituting feminism. But I also want to say that we probably should be continuing to see, and feminism and acts of feminism actually incorporated within the movements as they exist. And maybe, because we need to start thinking differently about what constitutes a feminist movement, or what a feminist movement would look like, or what issues we should be taking up as feminists. Because the reality of the matter is that within all of the work that Indigenous women are doing, the work that an Indigenous feminist, the work that Black feminists are doing, they're taking up issues of child apprehension, they're taking up issues of sexual assault, they're taking up all of these issues within the work that they're doing. But I think we said it earlier, is that it may not be, we're not thinking of it in feminist terms, but we also need to rethink the concept of feminism as that which is intersectional, right? If we start thinking of feminism as intersectional, then we know that these issues, and we know that all of it that we have been talking about are feminist issues. In fact, that's part of the struggle we had years ago to broaden the idea of what feminism is. So it is about, I think, shifting the terrain in terms of how white women, I particularly think, and how feminism has been constituted in this nation around whiteness and around gender in a particular way that doesn't allow for us to see feminism through multiple lenses, right? Intersecting at different points, right? And I think, and I mean, Harsha made some of these points earlier, so I won't reiterate it, but I'm saying that I think that's where I want to go and where I think we should be going, because this is where I'm also seeing where things are moving in that direction. And we should be expanding, the movement in terms of broadening the context in this way, as opposed to trying to figure out what it is like to build something called a feminist movement that somehow looks different to what is actually happening now.
Well, I mean, thank you so much for your answers to my questions. And I know our audience really appreciates it. And so if you, as the audience, have any more questions, you can submit them in the Q&A, which I'm taking a look at. And, one of the things we were talking about when we were planning this is what has happened to the student movement. And we were talking about, campuses are different now, but also so too is the student movement and various student unions. And so we have a question here from Joy Cujo, who says that, as a young Black woman, the entire feminist movement is critical to me. As both Harsha and Nora said, I fear that the movement is becoming more monotonous and a, quote, digital trend. However, it's an ongoing issue that constantly needs to be addressed. And she asks, how would you suggest mobilizing the student body at a university to fight for this initiative? And I think she means feminism in that. Nora, I'm going to get you to, what are your thoughts on how do you get the student body organized?
Yeah, one of the big problems, obviously, for the last 10 years, 15 years, has been the proliferation of student fees and debt. And student fees and debt have been the thing that has managed to crush student organizing, because when you're, working 3 jobs, or if you fail a course, it's effectively $5,000 out the window. I mean, the stakes are quite high. And so, I mean, that I think that's as that has really harmed on campus organizing. At the same time, we're also seeing that there's a lack of struggle to make sure that students have autonomous student organizations, and even the importance of having autonomous student organizations. So student organizations that are not funded or controlled in any way by the administration. And at the same time, we've seen administrations, disband the Student Federation at the University of Ottawa. There certainly has been a lot of funny business happening at Ryerson University, which is of course my old school, and I could talk for days about all the stuff happening at Ryerson. I won't do that. But it's absolutely critical that students have autonomous spaces to organize, and then so students broadly, and then under that, of course, students based on the identities or the issues that they're interested in. So you've got this multiple way of students being able to come together and to struggle and to organize. So I think, depending on what campus you're on, that work is always going on. That's always happening. It has just been severely damaged both by these external forces like tuition fees and by the internal pressures. And so students need to create those spaces. Do you have a gender center, a women's center, women's trans center on campus? Are you there? Are you struggling? Are you making sure their orientations are an anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-colonial kind of feminism, or are they continuing to organize through a mainstream white feminist lens? Like, that's an interesting place of struggle that you very easily could get involved in, because most of these centers are open for anybody, and you literally walk in and say, I want to get involved. So I really would encourage you to find those spaces. And if you find that those spaces are insufficient, there's nothing, that, other than, of course, time and how much money you have to pay for your tuition fees. People should be organizing new structures as well on campus, because that's the thing about campus life is there's always something that's new that you can kind of borrow from years past and bring it back to existence. And so look for those opportunities. Look for the professors and the staff on campus who are giving out radical vibes, and see if you can talk to them about the history of what's been going on your campus if you're not aware of it yet, and they will help to point you to the right people for sure.
Yeah, I want to fold in Beverly to that, because there is another question that is on a similar tack, which is from Jackie Gingras, who says that she's an academic and she's watching the corporate neoliberal administration attempt to silence and diminish equity and radical democracy. And she asks, could you speak to how faculty need to organize and support student organizing? And I'm wondering, Beverly, how do faculty step in and support students at this time when they want to be, organizing around feminism and radical ideas?
First and foremost, that the faculty should be actually, asking. I mean, the initiative has to come from students. And one of the things I'll tell you that I do with my students, and this is a place to start as someone who teaches in women and gender studies, is that I always insist on students organizing, taking up issues, confronting issues, pulling together and seeking out support from your faculty, the ones you feel who actually you see are doing political work or engaging in political issues, and have them work with you around how to move forward. And I'll just give you an example of one of the things that we did. So for instance, I had a student who came to me last year that student was put in handcuffs. Right? And that student didn't know what to do. And I asked that student, what would you want to do? Because this is something that you can be organizing and mobilizing around, because I'm sure there are other students who have experienced this. And as we started asking around, we found that there were more students who actually experienced this. And what we did is that we actually together penned a letter to the administration. And when that didn't seem to work, then we actually sought, the media support. We organized downtown, we brought students together, and we started speaking out on the issues, right? And started pushing the institution to actually consider removing campus from campus police, having the institution account to students for what was happening to them. Right? So the way that faculty can engage and support students by using their power, whatever power that they may have, particularly, listen, white faculty who are tenured have lots of power, and they often don't use it. At U of T, that is very often. And the the faculty that tend to actually support their students and take risks, you tend to be racialized faculty because they understand the context, because they too are also feeling unsupported in this environment that's neoliberal, that's racist, that's also an issue, that's also actually fueling, hiding behind what we call, these principles of free speech and, democratic freedom, which actually, of course, for racialized professors is important, but it's also being used as a way to silence particular kinds of discourse and to allow for certain ones. So for instance, we saw what happened in Ottawa with the use of this professor using the N-word, and how Quebec a slew of Quebec professors mobilized in support of this one professor. And so the importance is to counter. I mean, when we did the scholars strike, the whole point of the scholars strike that Min Suk and I organized or initiated and organized with other faculty was a way to start creating a kind of environment within the institution that allows for certain kinds of dissent, right? That allows for certain ways that certain things can come together very quickly and we can mobilize very quickly, is to actually create some kind of a contingent of people around the country as faculty who can actually come to start acting in situations like these. Because the reality of the matter is that we can't do it alone, because we see what's happening, as Nora talks about Ryerson. Doing it alone in isolation allows us to be actually undermined very, very, without other people witnessing, right? Especially in this climate, especially during the pandemic. So I think it's really critical that we start mobilizing on a much larger scale in terms of how we start on challenging issues of equity and issues of undermining frameworks that support Black and racialized faculty in the institution. And I think one of the things that the Scholars Strike that we try to do is to establish and to build community within the university environment, so that we have somewhere in which we can mobilize in event something like this happens, or students continue to be harmed in these situations, where we can mobilize around students, where faculty can have some sense of holding institutions accountable to as much as they can, because we know how that works, where we can have unions be responsible, right? CAUT will come under fire, right? I'm working on an article where they're going to come under fire because they supported the so-called free speech and of this particular professor, and the right of this professor to actually use this in the context of literature and academic freedom, and not all canon books written by white individuals need to be preserved. Some of these books that continue to dehumanize us as Blacks and as Indigenous and as racialized people should be committed to the cemetery of books. So there are all these things in which us as academics and as students can also mobilize together and actually engage together, because I think we also have to treat some of these political organizing not as simply this dichotomy of the professor, the student, but how can we as professor, understanding our power, understanding where we do have power, but how can we also start organizing with our students in this context in ways that also allow their power and their strength to come out in this process as individuals who are equally affected in particular kinds of ways.
And Harsha, I'm going to let you answer that question last. And I think it would be great, I think, for the people who aren't aware, to also bring in the answer the question of what does student organizing bring to feminist movements and to activist movements overall, and how do students organize at this time to be part of these conversations?
Yeah, I'll be brief. Beverly and Nora covered it so comprehensively. I think to echo that, a big part of this is, you know, as students get politicized around issues, so many issues, but for example, around the right to free education, that really is a way to start talking about so many other issues, right? When we talk about tuition increases, and we know that's been kind of one of the things that student movements have long kind of called for, is tuition freezes and or free tuition if they're that radical, because it really connects to, you know, capitalism and colonialism and all those kinds of structural issues. I think the one piece that I would add, in addition to student movements mobilizing and working with professors, is, you know, when I was part of the student movement at that time, many years ago, I won't date myself, there was a lot of active chapters of student worker solidarity, which also, you know, really raised the often more invisible issue of workers who are staff in university campuses who are not part of the academic staff, right? So service workers, retail workers, janitorial staff, et cetera. And that, I think, for me, was a really important part of my student movement mobilizing. I don't know what the state of the student movement is now, but if that's not a part of student mobilizing, I think that would be so important, because so many of us come from families where our families do actually work in universities, but, you know, not in the ways in which people may see represented in student, in the kind of organizing that we think of in universities, right? They're working in universities as so-called support staff. And so I think that's also an important part of student organizing, is connecting with workers in the university who are non-academic workers, because academics are also, of course, workers, but those who are laboring in other kinds of ways. And I think that's an important part of it, because I think, you know, those kinds of divisions between students and professors and workers, those silos really can be broken down if we have a more robust understanding of class struggle, a more robust understanding of feminist struggle, and a more, you know, to Beverly's excellent point, that kind of intersectional feminism, right? Where we see these issues connected. Perhaps we're differently located in this moment, but those issues are deeply connected. So I think that's really important. And that then connects to the role of the labor movement, right? The labor movement should also be active on campuses. The labor movement should be supporting student mobilizing, should absolutely be supporting professors and academic labor. And particularly because this whole kind of, you know, right-wing ideas around free speech and academic freedom, those themselves are not right-wing ideas, right? Those, we have to remember, came from the left. Ideas of free speech came from the Wobblies. But their current iteration, of course, is, you know, largely this kind of straw man of the right. And especially academic freedom, and in the, you know, abhorrent example that Beverly gave, it becomes that much more important for unions and to be present, right? To be present in that kind of space, and to support all kinds of labor that's happening. And really to take a more proactive role to support racialized women workers, to take a role in supporting abolitionist organizing, to support tuition, organizing against tuition increases, to take an anti-capitalist approach. And so I think that in the same way that we're talking about, you know, shifting, Beverly was talking about shifting the terrain of how we understand feminism, I think a little bit of that is also shifting and expanding the terrain of what student organizing looks like, so that it does really encompass all of these other issues that are happening at the site of the university.
Well, I thank you so much for that. I think students, genuinely, if you're a student and you didn't start, you know, brain didn't start firing about what to do next, I would be very surprised. And actually, I have one question that came from one of our audience members. Beverly, are there plans for a scholar strike 2.0?
Well, not at this point, but we are thinking about some other way of future bringing scholars and students together.
That's wonderful. I love that.
We haven't figured out how that's going to work yet, but we have been talking about it, about what that would look like. So we are, and it was good to see. I saw a note from, I think it was Jackie, who said that they attended it and that it had a profound impact on them. The fact that that students, we asked that no classes be offered in the first semester, and students instead attend the scholar strike, and teachers don't teach, professors don't teach, but participate and attend. And they did say it had a profound effect and impact on their lives and on how they are going to be coping in terms of, how what skills it actually provided them, or what a knowledge basis it provided them to actually cope with the conditions within the university. And I think that feels very, very satisfying to hear.
And I think
Can
it's
I just
amazing
add,
work.
Oh,
yeah,
sorry, I was going to say, I just want to echo Jackie's thanks for and appreciation for Scholar Strike, not as a student, but just very much, so much gratitude for that work in that series as well of events, and the importance of the Scholar Strike.
Yeah, and I want to echo that. And I also want to thank all of you for your work and for taking the time to join us here. And I want to thank all of the various support members of this team, as well as Kike and Salman, for inviting myself to moderate and in allowing me to lead this conversation with all of you brilliant minds. So there's just one last bit, and I think I'm going to hand it off to Kike. Rather, I'll say it. I just want to remind people to share your feedback with us. And if we could bring up those slides so you can get in touch with us. And also to get a hold of Nora's fantastic new book. It's, really, if you thought you knew the internet, you don't know what has happened on the internet. It's so much on there that I think you should learn from. And coming out next year is Harsha's book, Border and Race, and I think Border and Rule rather, and I think that is going to be a very exciting time. And again, I just want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank Ryerson for continuing to support Social Justice Week, and Kike and Salman for getting us all together for this week. And I think in a tough time, we all needed to hear each other again and to be inspired by each other's words.
Thank you very much, Vicky.
Thank you.
Thank you to
Thanks,
Nora,
everybody.
and
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Kike and everybody, and Chris and Salman and the whole team. Thank you all. This was amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you for interpreting.